Thank you very much for joining us. Grateful to you for joining us in the last hours before lockdown in the UK, at least. Thank you, Walid, very much for joining us. Super excited to hear more about this project that you and a few others with the IMF have been working on to save elephants and also work on a new method of carbon capture. So really excited to hear more. Thank you very much. Also, big thank you, quickly shout out to Tracer. So they're sponsoring this Tech for Sustainability series. So hugely grateful to them. They're a connected value chain platform for working to foster a culture of innovation and sustainable business practice in the diamond industry to ensure consumer trust and provide authenticity of natural diamonds and prove that they're not from blood diamonds, blood mines, and also helping local economies where they're mined. So thank you very much to Tracer. That's community.tracer.com. And Walid, thank you very much for joining us. And just as a shout out, Ian Redmond, who's also been working on this project as a conservationist, is here and will hopefully be able to input a few words. So thank you all for joining us. Look forward to hearing more.
Thank you very much for having me, Erica. I'm truly honored. And thank you for Tracer for sponsoring this show also. So hi, guys. For those of you who don't know me, so I'm Walid Al-Sakaf. So I'm actually the founder of Intrablogs. We're a podcast and boutique consultancy firm on blockchain. So what really kicked off a lot of this thinking, if you want, and I'm going to share my screen, is mainly around a podcast I had the pleasure of doing with Ralph Chammy. And what Ralph talked about is basically, how is wildlife being valued? And I'm going to cover this in the slides to come. So this is an African forest elephant, not as well known as the savanna-based elephants that we see very often, but they play a critical role. I'm afraid to say that by the end of this webinar, 3 to 4 elephants will have been killed by a poacher. Just to put things in perspective. And this is some of the horrible scenes that do come out. And across West Africa, more than 2/3 of the forest elephants have been killed in the last decade, ranging from 95% in the Democratic Republic of Congo to 30% in Gabon, according to the Guardian newspaper. And that's only for $40,000 per elephant, according to the IMF, which is a piece that Ralph Chammy mentioned in the podcast we did. $40,000 for this beautiful creature, his life is killed. And unfortunately, things have gotten worse, with COVID-19. People are not traveling anymore. So wildlife safaris, tourism has been put on hold. And what this has done is that it means it has put the livelihood of wildlife ranger jobs at risk, and they've been cut because there's crucial source of income from tourists at wildlife safaris has evaporated because of COVID-19. And that has led to a big growth in poachers. So let's think about why are forest elephants important? Well, I don't know if you know, but deforestation in Africa is happening 4 times faster than the global rate, resulting in an average loss of 40,000 square kilometers per year. So, all these numbers, they seem big, they seem important. Most of the time, it just flies by us, right? So I made a small note here regarding the Nile River, and I'll explain to you why. So Gabon, for example, it's 88% forest. The whole territory is 80% covered by forest. And the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is right next to Gabon, huge country, is also very much forest. Now, what's interesting is that the tropical rainforests that those 2 countries have, they contain a huge amount of moisture. And that moisture, evaporates and it's carried by the air currents, and it rains a lot in the Nile basin, which means that if deforestation continues, the amount of water that's replenishing the line is going to shrink. And the Nile could be at a risk of drying up. So let me put this in context of what's happening today in the world. I believe it's Ethiopia is looking at building this massive dam, to create, electricity, to power its economy. And that has put a lot of pressure for countries like Sudan and countries like Egypt. Egypt even said, that they may consider military attack because of that dam. So this is kind of the geopolitical issues that comes with building a dam, but yet we don't consider the impact deforestation can have in drying up the Nile. And hopefully what you're going to start to see is that the more you dig into the impact wildlife has on us, the more you start to realize it's actually a lot bigger than we think it is. And forest elephants are actually a critical role in keeping those rainforests alive. And Ian Redman did a famous TED talk about that subject, where he talks about how forest elephants are the great gardeners of the forest. And that has a lot to do with, with the kinds of fruits that they eat, the seeds that go through their digestive body, and when they poop them out, the fertilizer that it provides, for that. And that's not always being well understood by the wider community outside of scientists and conservationists, but it is a very important role. And each forest elephant can stimulate a net increase in carbon capture in Central African rainforests of 9,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide per kilometer, which makes the forest elephant valued, according to Ralph Chamia at the IMF, $1.75 million within its average of a 60-year lifespan. $1.75 million, the value of an elephant alive compared to the $40,000 of an elephant dead. We have a market for dead nature. We have no market for living nature, even though the services that they provide is so critically important. If you think about the conversation I just told you about the Nile River and the whole question about that dam. So after the podcast was Ralph Chamia, I was rapidly introduced to Ian Redman virtually the day after. And the three of us, each with our respective skill sets, decided, you know what, we need to do something about it. How can we create a market for a living nature? And this is what we came up with, which is, okay, well, what should that market be? And our vision is we want to build a resilient, equitable, and sustainable economy underpinned by a regenerative nature and thriving local communities. So prosperous economy, regenerative nature, thriving communities. And the way this is going to do is that we want to be, for change. We want to transform carbon exchange markets into a driving force for good and bringing transparency, traceability, and trust to them. And that's where the blockchain comes in. But we're not going to be a charity. I have full respect for charities, but I believe a for-profit organization has the kind of mindset and efficiency that is required to make this happen. But crucially, all the profits are reinvested back into identifying other living assets, such as the elephant, maybe the whales, maybe the gorillas, and so on, to regenerate nature, raising living standards whilst growing our economies. Growing a prosperous economy does not mean extracting away from nature. So we want to reinvest the profits to be able to identify other living assets, because at the end of the day, we're really running against the clock. Time is running out, as has been explained over and over again to us by David Attenborough, including in his recent documentary on Netflix. And this is what I mean by reinvesting into local communities. We are able to use the carbon exchange markets to provide jobs for rangers, like the ones in the two images above, but at the same time, provide micro investment opportunities to help build educational opportunities for example, for young girls or schools, on the other side. There is a direct link, again, explained by David Attenborough, that if you raise living standards and you raise women education, you slow down population growth, which we have to look at that, because we consume a lot and then Earth can so much sustain us to such a degree level. So I'm just going to skip through that. But effectively what we're trying to do is, as I say, is regenerating the economy, carbon exchange markets, powering a new resilient, equitable, and sustainable economy. That feeds into regenerative nature, protecting and ideally repopulating existing living assets, Republic Democratic of Congo has lost 95% of its elephants. How can we bring that back up to 100%? And we want to empower local communities in developing economies to prosper. And I'm going to show you how. So bear with me. This is a little bit complicated, but for those of you who have an appreciation of blockchain, you'll understand this very rapidly. But for the others, this will walk you through it step by step, because I need you to understand how we're going to build this marketplace. So we're going to take an enterprise, and let's say for argument's sake, we're taking Apple. Okay, Apple wants to offset X amount of carbons over Y number of years. So then that kind of goes to the carbon, what I call the carbon calculator, which is effectively the algorithm that Ralph Chammy has built. And what it does is that it checks how many elephants do we have on the platform that could potentially absorb all this carbon, right? So you've got a number of factors you got to look at, the location, the age of the elephant, and a number of other factors to see what is the amount that they can capture. So let's say we have 3 elephants that can capture the amount of carbon that Apple wishes to offset over a period of 2 years. That a price is given for that, to which then Apple transfer, let's say $1 million to an escrow account where the money is held securely within that place. What happens next is that you will have some kind of, ideally, and again, as I said, this is only 5 weeks old, some kind of IoT sensor that is non-intrusive, that doesn't hurt or any way bother the animal, to be able to monitor the health of the animal. You want the sensor to be able to say, effectively, am I alive or not? Because as I said, at the end of the presentation, 3 to 4 elephants would have been killed by a poacher. So the sensor is here to say, am I alive or not? If I am alive, that information goes into what we call a smart contract. Now, a small contract, all it is effectively an algorithm that says, if X happens, do Y. So in this instance, if the sensor says, hi, elephant is alive, then you issue what is called an asset-backed token. So what it is just effectively a digital token that is backed by the money that sits in the escrow account. Okay, it's just a digital representation of that money. So let's say every elephant provides 1 token at the end of the day. Now, those tokens are disbursed partly to the actual, let's say, ranger who's here to protect the elephant. That's his livelihood or her livelihood. That goes on their mobile phone. And some of the tokens are provided to the local communities, let's say village of elders, to decide how they wish to invest that money. The token facility sends information to escrow accounts saying, I've issued 3 tokens. And each of these individuals or organizations can then spend the tokens within a utility-based company or a grocery shop for the individual. Or let's say the village chief says, we're going to buy some solar panels, to provide some electricity for parts of the village. When those tokens are collected by, let's say, the grocery shop at the end of the week or at the end of the month, they're sent back to us to say, send us the cash. And a bit of reconciliation is done between the tokens issued and the tokens collected. And we send the tokens are converted into cash. The reason we do it this way is because we don't want to be in a situation where we have basically truckloads of cash going around, parts of Africa to distribute it to the employees or to the village of elders. It's a security risk and it's extremely expensive. Here, by doing it in this manner, we keep it very clean, very efficient, and it's very transparent. Because if you think about it, what does Apple get about this? They not only get a clear and efficient manner to offset their carbon, but also they get visibility of how their money is being used. So it hits the corporate social responsibility angle. It provides an opportunity for Apple to say, well, I've spent $1 million offloading my carbon to the Regen platform, but I've also helped through this money to build 2 schools. And I think that's a very powerful message, because if you think about it, the existing carbon exchange markets, they're very often described as murky, lacking transparency, lacking traceability, full of middlemen whose sole purpose is to profit for themselves. Here we're completely cutting out the middleman. There's no middleman involved. There's elephants. And you have the full transparency and traceability. The enterprise Apple can see, yes, my living assets are still alive because the sensor tells me that. And I can see how the money is being used. It's helped to build 2 schools. This is a very powerful message that is enabled by blockchain technology. So effectively, what we're doing is that we're taking this toxic asset, carbon, and we're transforming it into an asset that is for social good. And the elephant is the key in that transformation. Thank you. So I wanted to now perhaps move to more of a kind of a interactive kind of discussion now that I provided you this framework of what our thinking is, because I think the real value comes from the kind of interaction that we have, between you guys and me. So if you have, any questions, please, feel free to shout them out, and I'll happily take them. Ian, you're on the show, if you want to jump in and talk also about, your wonderful analogy of how the elephants are the great gardeners of the forest, please feel free.
I've just asked Ian to share and promoted him to a panelist.
Hi, Ian.
thrust you in the limelight, Ian. No, Walid, thank you so much. That was super interesting. And Ian, thank you for joining us. Ian, I think you're muted still, so we won't be able to hear you until you unmute. But thank you so much for joining us. Super interesting. What I should say to everybody who hasn't joined our live chats before, please do post questions just in the Q&A. We've got a Q&A function, so do put any more questions in there. We've also got a chat feature, so if you want to say anything, do share that in that. So yeah, please do post all questions in the Q&A. Thank you, guys. We do have a couple sort of preliminary questions. The first question from Mike Davis for you guys to chuck out there. How can you guarantee the additionality, leakage and permanence of the emission reduction projects? Is there a verified emissions reduction or certified program for that?
So that's a very good question, Mike. And this is something that we're actively, looking at. So for example, we're in conversations with a number of senior members of governments within African states to be able to come to an agreement, what those emission reduction projects and, verifying, those emissions reductions. The thing is that when you look at the existing carbon exchange market, and even, the price of carbon, it's very different from market to market. And there's not yet a uniform approach to it. What Ralph has done within the IMF is taken some very strong scientific data and put it monetary evaluation to it. This needs, of course, to be stress tested. And that's part of the conversations we're having those government officials in Africa, but also hopefully with regulators to come to some kind of agreement that this is verified.
Cool, thank you. Arthur is asking, are you looking to collaborate with any other carbon offsetting organizations, such as a Gold Standard, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely open to all kinds of collaboration. I mean, again, in all these kind of things, it's about, at what time is the right time to do it. Mm-hmm. This is, again, it's a 5-week-old project.
Sure.
So we're definitely open to all kinds of collaboration. But I think what is key, and I think it's related to one of the other questions by Arthur, which is, we want to be able to launch this ASAP. So we want to launch this next year. A very simple, pilot that could involve literally just 2 or 3 enterprises and a handful of elephants just to prove the model, and then to be able to expand, and then bringing the relevant, carbon offsetting organizations to partner with us. Because if you think about it, the token that I talked to you about in my diagram, that could effectively be the point of interaction with other organizations around the interoperability piece. And I think that's where we could eventually come to a situation where there is agreement on price, or there's agreement in terms of how do we verify emissions and how do we certify that. But so hopefully through the work that we can do, we can facilitate this kind of collaboration for that kind of agreement to happen.
Cool, thanks. And I know you've said you want to get it up and running. Sorry, Ian.
Well, I was going to chip in with the premise of Ralph Chalmers' calculation is a study by a French team that looked at the above ground carbon in forests with elephants and in similar forests where the elephants have been extirpated. Sadly, there are many such forests. And what they discovered was there was about a 7% difference, which they attributed to the fact that elephants, when they're feeding, trample and eat small plants. Many of them are plants whose seeds have been dispersed by elephants, but not all of those plants are going to grow to maturity. And more carbon is stored in large trees. So if you think of it as if you're growing vegetables in your garden, you don't want all the wildflowers that some gardeners call weeds taking up all the nutrients and space and light of your vegetables. So you weed them out, and then you put those weeds into a compost heap. And when they've mulched down and decomposed, you put that compost on the vegetables and the nutrients go into your vegetables. So the elephants effectively are doing that. They're inadvertently trampling or eating weeds, which allows them to decompose on the ground or in the elephant and come out as droppings, which is nutrient-rich fertilizer. And they're doing this at a rate, in terms of the dung production, an adult elephant is going to be producing something like 1 metric ton of manure every week. So if you've got a park with 1,000 elephants in it, that's 1,000 tons of first-class organic manure every week. And that is going into the big trees, which are already storing more carbon and are putting on more carbon. So that difference between presence of elephants and no elephants is what has been measured. It hasn't been done live with each individual elephant. So we have to convince the carbon markets that this is a real effect. And it's in a peer-reviewed paper, and it's what Ralph based his calculations on. And he's, at each stage of the calculation, taken the conservative estimate. Obviously, these are scientific estimates, and there's a range of values, confidence limits. But if you always err on the cautious side, then you're sort of justifiable to go to the next stage. And that's where this price of $1.75 million per elephant over its lifetime, which boils down to about $30,000 a year or $80 a day per elephant. Now, that's the sort of figure which the average manager of a protected area can't even dream of for funding the conservation of those elephants, which is why they're being lost so fast. And for people living next to elephant habitat, if elephants come out of the forest and raid their crops, or from an elephant's perspective, eat the new plants that are where the old plants used to be, well, it means that if they prove that those elephants are alive by taking a photograph or somehow confirming their identity, and this could be done through a DNA sample from the dung, or it could be done through the infrasonic communications, which may be attributable to an individual elephant, or it could be done through photographs showing the ear shape and tusk size. And so, okay, you know this is an elephant who is on the register, and that farmer who's just lost half of his crop can confirm that that elephant is alive today, then he or she gets the daily payment. But the exact mechanism obviously needs to be worked out, because as what he said, this is a new concept, and we want it to be challenged. We want people to ask really difficult questions, because it has to stand up to scrutiny if it is going to be the basis of millions of dollars worth of trading, and the lives of many elephants, and the future prosperity of thousands of people living in elephant habitat who will be lifted out of poverty by it. So it needs to stand up to scrutiny, and we would welcome any constructive criticism or comments.
Exactly. Can this work with any type of elephant?
Well, the calculation was done on African forest elephant, which are now considered by most scientists to be a separate species from the savanna elephant. Mm-hmm. But literally within the same couple of weeks that I met Ralph and Walid, a paper was published in Kenya of a 20-year study of savanna habitat, where some plots had elephants excluded, some plots just had cattle, some plots had cattle and wildlife. And looking at the different ones, they concluded that those plots with cattle and wildlife and elephants had the most soil carbon and the highest nutrient levels in the soils. Mm-hmm. So even there, we haven't yet done the calculations, but the presence or absence of elephants affects the ecosystem. And it's something which I've and other ecologists have been banging on about for decades as a theoretical construct. But Ralph Sharma is the first person to actually calculate down to the ecosystem service provided by an individual animal. And we hope then to apply that to other species. I specialize in gorillas, as you can tell from over my shoulder, and elephants, but potentially other terrestrial species. And of course, Ralph, before he did forest elephants, did that calculation for the great whales, the baleen whales and sperm whales, that have a huge impact on the amount of phytoplankton that benefit from the whales' fecal plumes. They don't produce dung, they produce clouds of nutrients, which are known poetically as a fecal plume. And you get a lot more phytoplankton growing where whales have pooed, and that sequesters more carbon. And therefore, there's a similar $2 million a whale valuation on a whale over the course of its life. And then that suddenly makes whales more valuable than carelessly allowing them to be hit by ships or affected by human activities, or in a worst case scenario, actually killed by humans because their meat is worth some money. But suddenly you have a counter economic pressure, whether it's against whales for meat or elephants for ivory, that is independent of tourism. As Walid said, the COVID crisis worldwide has led to a collapse of wildlife tourism and all the conservation activities that were funded by that. But the animals are still going about their business, eating food, producing manure, spreading seeds, sequestering carbon. And if we put a value on that, it doesn't need wealthy visitors from Europe or America to fly in and look at them. It is their intrinsic, not their worth as an animal, but the service that animal provides. So you're valuing the service, not the creature itself.
And that's a key distinction. You know, we're not here to privatize animals. That's not at all what we're doing. All we're doing is recognizing the valuable services they're providing and putting a price tag to it for us to pay, because that is it seems to be the only way we're going to be able to preserve those animals is when you have the market that benefits from them.
So elephants are the guinea pig, effectively.
Yes. And there's numerous reasons for that, because you know, they're terrestrial based, you know, they're not water based. So it's easier, you know, to hopefully work with them. Some of the locations we're looking at to doing our pilot is that it's within one jurisdiction, where if there is the right legal environment, then we can also put a legal wrapper, if you want, around that asset. So there's all these reasons why we're starting off with the African forest elephant first. But the key is to be able to expand to other living assets as fast as possible.
Okay, cool. No, thank you. That makes sense. Vladimir is asking, just because this can be done using blockchain, why use blockchain? What benefits does it bring?
So Vladimir, that's a very good question. And actually, it's a question I ask all my speakers on intro blogs, you know, so why did you actually need a blockchain for it? And I think for me, there's a couple of reasons. One is that blockchain is great from a traceability standpoint for providing transparency, providing immutability, and especially because we're going to be using tokens. I think it makes it a natural technology to use that for. There is, of course, other incentives for it, let's say. For those of you who are familiar with blockchain, you may have heard about the Plastic Bank, which is led by David Katz. It's very similar to what we're doing. Actually, it provided us the template on how to do this correctly. And IBM, who is a big builder of blockchain, was, you know, a supporter of the Plastic Bank. And to be honest, they spent a lot of money advertising about what a Plastic Bank does. And we believe that this project will give the right company the opportunity for them to share their values by supporting this. But fundamentally, I do believe that blockchain is the right platform for this, for providing transparency, for providing traceability, for providing trust, accountability, and also from the token perspective. And if I may answer the other question you had, Vlad, which was with regards to IoT sensors. Yes, I agree. Sensors, can be hacked, and that's why in those kind of situations you've got to use a multiple array of verification of the animal being alive. Perhaps not so much for the African forest elephant, but definitely for the savanna one, is to be able to use like the Sentinel-3 satellite from the European Space Agency, which can provide, visual confirmation that elephant is still, alive and kicking. So it's by using a whole different array of different confirmation mechanisms that I think we can mitigate that risk.
Cool, thank you. Valencia is asking about how one can incorporate ecotourism in the picture. So Ian, that's 100% a question for you.
If these elephants become known as individuals, then the potential for some form of ecotourism analogous to mountain gorilla viewing, where suddenly with mountain gorillas, it went from being a species with a small population to being a population of known individuals whose life cycles are followed. And when there's a birth, everyone celebrates. And when there's a death, people literally grieve at the loss of a silverback or an elderly female, but you have the satisfaction of seeing their kids and their grandchildren. So it becomes part of the thinking, as it is in Rwanda and Uganda and in Eastern DRC, that these mountain gorillas really matter. And the economic basis for that has been tourism. But if we can demonstrate that they play a measurable role in the carbon sequestration, and that there are other ecosystem services that could come in, water in particular, because these same forests that sequester carbon also through evapotranspiration are putting water vapor into the atmosphere, which is then carried around the world. And as Walid mentioned, forms some of the catchment area of the Nile, also the Zambezi, and those rains you can trace back to the Congo Basin. And indeed, a lot of water vapor even goes to fall into the Amazon Basin, where an even bigger weather system will come out and water the Midwest and come across the Atlantic to Europe. So I can show you an animation of the invisible rivers that happen in the sky that feed the rivers that we see and think of as rivers. We say, where does the river come from? Oh, it's rainfall on the hills. But where does the rain come from? It comes from water vapor in the atmosphere. And where does that come from? Well, some of it comes from evaporation in the oceans, of course, but tropical forests, it has been estimated, a unit area of tropical forest puts 8 or 10 times more water vapor into the atmosphere than the same area of sea. So there's evaporation from all over, but it acts as a sort of a global pump. So if you think of the Earth as having a 3-chambered heart, Amazonia, the Congo Basin, and the Southeast Asian rainforests of Borneo and New Guinea, those 3 chambers only operate because of the rainforests in them through evapotranspiration, putting water vapor into the atmosphere. And those rainforests depend on almost all the trees. Between 75 and 96% of tropical tree species depend on animals to distribute their seeds. And the trees with big seeds need big animals. So there are some species that actually can't survive without elephants to swallow their big fist-sized seeds and disperse them. But of course, these are trees whose life cycle is measured in centuries, if not millennia. So when you see a forest giant with hundreds of tons of carbon, because it takes 10 people with their arms outstretched to encircle the base, and that's going up to emerge above the canopy of the forest, that's huge. But that's there because of an ecological event perhaps 1,000 years ago, when an elephant or a gorilla ate a seed and pooped it out. And that seedling got lucky and didn't get trampled and eventually become a massive tree. So we were talking, someone was asking about permanence in the carbon. If you want these forests to be permanently sequestering and storing carbon, you need the ecological events today to produce the trees of tomorrow, which is why this method of protecting elephants is inspired. Because at the moment, if you live in a poor community a long way from the capital city, and some foreigner comes in and says, "Psst, hey, you want to help me kill an elephant? I'll give you $200. $200 to a poverty-stricken villager is a lot of money. But if his reply is going to be, actually, no, we're getting $80 a day for ensuring these elephants stay alive, the poachers are going to find it hard to recruit guides and porters and all those vulnerable people who are keen to enter the cash economy but don't have a way of doing so. So the theoretical construct that Ralph Shami has used and the blockchain technology that Walid brings to this suddenly presents people like me who spend their lives trying to ensure that the world becomes a safe place for apes and elephants and other species. It's beyond exciting. You have to make it work.
Exactly. And just to build on that is, I mean, Erica, perhaps, we can talk about it later, but we're launching tomorrow at 5:30 a kickoff session for a whole range of people who have volunteered to support, this initiative. By support, I mean, basically we're setting up a whole range of working groups because this can't be done just by Ian, myself, and Ralph. We're not enough. So we need a lot more minds to get into it. And I think what we just demonstrated is that the unique skill sets that Ian, myself, and Ralph bring are extremely complementary, but we need a really multidisciplinary approach to this because this can be tackled from so many different angles. And the more multidisciplinary it is, the better we have a chance of success. But perhaps, if I regroup some of the questions I've seen come up in the Q&A. So yes, we are focusing initially on an elephant, and the name over there, Regen, is about, we want to increase that population growth. It's too small already. They need to start to grow to have more babies effectively. And there's strong incentives. If a local community is getting, let's say, $80 a day from one elephant, what happens if you have 2 or 3, elephants? You can see the exponential growth that represents for them. And with regards to the question about blockchain, so no, we haven't made a decision, on whether it's going to be on Ethereum or whether it's going to be on Hyperledger Fabric or Corda or anything else. We are exploring all these kind of conversations, but it is still very much in our early days. So we are in conversations also with a number of enterprise. I mean, I mentioned Apple just as an example. We're not yet in a conversation with Apple. I'm hoping for that day to come. Let me see what else in terms of questions.
Insurance.
Yes, insurance. So yes, of course, insurance can play, I think, a very large role actually in this part. If you think about it, that the elephant as an asset, you need to protect that asset. If the community is dependent upon that asset, is there an opportunity to put an insurance, product around that? But equally, if you're giving a local community the opportunity, to get this regular income, for example, the ranger or any others. And if you think about the ranger and all the other people who are directly responsible for the well-being of that animal, think about them as part of a gig economy, right? So they're suddenly becoming bankable. They're entering the financial inclusion, kind of ladder system. So there is opportunity for micro insurance products. Really, what I think the opportunity really is here is that carbon exchange market is the foundation layer that can enable the creation of new products and services. And it's really open to insurers and to startups and to other kinds of companies to be creative in what kinds of products and services they can build on top of it.
Thank you. There's a few questions about sort of what companies can get involved and how companies can actually offset their own carbon footprint. Is there any way that companies can offset their carbon footprint with this method? And if so, are there costs associated?
So if they want to offset their carbon emissions to us, yes, so basically they will say, how many metric tons of carbon they want to offset over what period of time. And then, as I said in the carbon calculator, and we try to figure out how many elephants that we have that are available. So if think of each elephant as having a ledger of some sort that says, I'm booked between now and the next 10 years or whatever. So there will come a time, hopefully, I don't think we're going to hit that point where we don't have enough elephants. Hopefully we will, because that's a really good success. If you take Gabon, for example, as an example, they have 45,000 elephants. 45,000 elephants, that comes out to close to 50 billion worth of asset they have there if we're able to put them all into the system. So it's a great opportunity. But I think related to a question that was asked earlier on also is that this is not just for large companies, this is also available for small companies. And I would argue also for individuals. Imagine the opportunity that if you're taking a flight from London and you're flying up to New York, says, do you wish to offset your carbon emissions by paying 1 day worth of an elephant service? That's awesome. That creates an emotional response also, instead of, yes, I will buy 2 carbon credits. That means nothing to me. But if I say I'm paying for the well-being and the safeguarding of an elephant, and that money is also used to help, raise the living standards of people in developing economies, you now have a very compelling message, I think.
Cool, thank you. Andy is asking if companies can receive returns for investing in the active protection and growth of animals which can reduce carbon, but in very any wild animals at all.
Well, so I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean by returns. If it is, returns.
For example, a financial return, is there any way that, I think that's his question, if there's any way that a company can get an ROI other than the social credit?
Well, I think the biggest ROI for them is they're getting a clear offset of their carbon, that it's actually being offset. There's no transparency issue involved there, and no middlemen involved, as there is with other carbon exchange. But there's also, I think, the best return is from the corporate social responsibility standpoint, is that they're seeing how that money is being used. Now, if you're referencing to the return that they could be getting, from the money sitting in the escrow account, then I would say no, that money that sits in the escrow account goes to Regen to effectively empower our ability to sign up other living assets onto our system as fast as possible. So that's, for me, is the return for them. It's having a clear and effective way to offset their carbon. And the second one is from a corporate social responsibility, seeing how their funds are being used in a manner to raise living standards in developing economies.
Vlad's got a few technical questions for you, which we'll let Ian off of. What blockchain are you using? And he's also asking about what controls you'd be putting in place to ensure that the code and the smart contracts you're using is correct and without errors, because obviously there have been cases of smart contracts not being audited. And so is that something that you have looked into?
So not at this stage. And as I said, I think a few answers ago, we haven't yet identified what is the ideal blockchain platform. Because, you could look at it, from a couple of angles. You look at this as an enterprise solution. So here, you're pretty much going for either Hyperledger Fabric or with Corda, and it's basically to enable just enterprises to offset their carbon emissions. They're not very strong on the token side, so they don't make them, the ideal scenario. You can go for an Ethereum-based solution, which is great, when we want to expand to the mass consumer market, and it's very effective for tokens. But that brings, some issues, with regards to enterprises. We're not quite yet comfortable with public blockchains like Ethereum. Now, there are, of course, other platforms that are out there, like Hedera Hashgraph, which could be an option. But as I say, we're at this stage, we haven't yet identified the right platform, because it's not just about looking at what is the best technology platform. It's also about looking at what is the best partner. And I'll give you an example. So the Plastic Bank, when they looked at, not the Plastic Bank, sorry, Farmers Connect, completely different, but it's a consortium that is around initially coffee. They worked with IBM for a couple of reasons. Is that a lot of the retailers that they wanted to connect with are actually using IBM cloud-based technologies. So for them, it made that kind of sense. So the point I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of factors that need to be looked at in identifying what is the right blockchain platform for this specific project, both in the short term and then the long term.
Cool, thank you. One question, because Valerio was asking about adding or tokenizing ecotourism, and obviously Ian now has a virtual ecotourism company, and one question I would have now in the world of coronavirus and lockdown is there anything around either virtual ecotourism that can be done around this, or an idea, for example, where often people will buy packages to sponsor an animal, and then every year or every few months or so they get updates about the animal, how it's going, and get every photos every so often. Is that something that you could be doing for companies that are looking to partner, maybe?
That could be a part of it. And it would be pretty amazing if you could sort of put on a VR headset and you're in the forest,
and sync to the sensors
whose services you're paying for. I think that as a reward for the person or company buying the carbon credits would be amazing, and what an amazing educational tool too, and so thereby understanding the role of these species. I'm sure that the focus on carbon is purely, it's convenient because there is a carbon market. As yet, there isn't a water market. All the benefits that we get from forests that aren't yet available in a ready-made market may one day come on stream, particularly water and this general concept of biodiversity credits. Well, biodiversity is the whole wealth of life, and tropical rainforests are the most biodiverse terrestrial habitat. They're the coral reefs of the land. And many of those species are ecologically dependent on the elephants and the gorillas and the species who disperse the seeds, because if you're an insect feeding on a particular tree species, if that tree's seeds are not dispersed and grow into a new tree, then your future is limited. And we don't know the potential benefits in terms of chemicals that might have pharmaceutical or other uses to humans, because we haven't even identified most of the species that live in these forests, let alone studied their interrelationships or reduced any of them to chemicals that might or might not help a human medical problem or other use. So the potential down the line of other values to come in is great. And even with the carbon, we're taking the value at the conservative end at each stage of the calculation. And yet even so, we're talking about millions of dollars per elephant over their lifetime. So it is transforming the people who have heard of this, which is very few at the moment. The listeners to this discussion are joining a very select group of people who have become aware of this as a concept. It is very much the start. And I noticed Jean-Pierre was questioning whether it's really a carbon offset because it doesn't seem additional. Well, the UN has a program called REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation of forests. And the plus is supposed to be all the added benefits. We're actually focusing on the plus aspect of it, because at the moment, tropical forests are a carbon sink. They take in carbon and store it. But as soon as it goes wrong, either through degradation, putting a road through, excess logging, excess hunting, then they become a source of carbon. And carbon emissions from the decomposing wood and other vegetable matter are adding to the CO2 burden in the atmosphere rather than doing the opposite. So by protecting elephants, you are ensuring that that elephant premium on the carbon storage of that forest remains. By increasing the number of elephants and hopefully allowing them to recolonize forests in which they have been extirpated, then you're putting that carbon, the elephant premium back into those forests. So there is additionality, but initially it's based on this theoretical construct. And for some countries or parks where there isn't yet accurate monitoring infrastructure, it might have to be done on a regular count. Now, counting forest elephants until very recently has depended upon a transect walks through a forest and you can't count the piles of poo. And you work out how many elephants must there be to produce that number of piles of poo that haven't yet decomposed. So you need a decomposition rate and you need a production rate. How many piles of poo does an elephant produce each day? And it comes up with an estimate of how many elephants are in the forest, but with huge confidence limits. And what was exciting I learned recently is that a recent survey of forest elephants went beyond counting the piles of poo and actually took DNA samples from each dropping. And if you do that repeatedly, then it's like you're marking the elephant, and your chances of recapturing that marked individual gives you a way of calculating more accurately the number. But with any identification of individuals, eventually you'll have them all. And then you're not dealing with estimates of with confidence limits. You actually know how many elephants there are. So the money that this would generate, that would put at the disposal of whoever's managing that habitat, whether it's a timber company, if it's a sustainable timber company that's taking out occasional trees but still maintaining a healthy forest, if it's a national park, or if it's a community forest, whoever is responsible will have the means to put in sensors. It's very hard to see forest elephants because of all the trees. But elephants vocalize using infrasound. And there's been a long-term study off the coast of Vancouver of orcas called Orca Lab. I know about it because the Born Free Foundation that I work with a lot has been funding it for years. And they have hydrophones in the sea with a system of triangulation. When an orca swims by vocalizing, they recognize who it is because they've got distinctive sonograms. So they can say, oh, look, that's so-and-so. She hasn't been around for a while. And they know roughly where she is and where she's going through triangulation of the microphones. So there is an elephant listening project in forests in Central Africa. They haven't yet been looking at individuals. So that's a new idea that we're going to put in. But the other big change in studying in forests in recent years has been grids of camera traps. So camera traps record individuals. If you go to my YouTube channel, you can see a nice little bit of elephants walking by a camera trap in northern Congo. And those elephants would be identifiable from the image on the camera trap. Once again, if you can identify an individual and you back up either the sonogram or the photograph with a DNA sample, then you start to get actually a census of individuals rather than an estimate of a population. And then you get down to very precise, this company can buy the services provided by this elephant for the foreseeable future. And if there's a poaching incident, then the money isn't paid. There's a real incentive on those who live in that forest to make sure poachers don't come and kill the elephant because the money will stop coming.
Exactly. And how do you know, a practical question for me, if there's, for example, community looking after a group of elephants, how can you ensure that the money is distributed fairly? Because you could, in theory, have a community leader who takes it all, and then you've got individuals who don't get any of it. And then if a tourist goes along to them and says, hey, I'll give you $200 to kill this elephant, because they're not seeing their share of the $80 per elephant a day, they're like, well, hey, this isn't fair, and I want to punish the people that are taking the money for it. Yeah, I'll take the $200 to let you kill the elephant.
Yeah, and this is where, if you want, the tokens become very interesting, because if you look at the rangers themselves, you can deliver the token straight to their mobile phone, so they get the token for completing that role. With regards to the local community, you will need some kind of, village of elders who decide, how the money is spent. But here again, you've got there's a fine balance between having a situation where the North dictates to the South how they should spend. And you don't want that. You're here to empower them. But at the same time, you want to create the right kind of incentives for how the money to be spent. If they decide, I want to buy a couple of crates of beer, it's not great. It was what we want to do. But that's where you look at, in terms of incentive mechanisms that say, if you want to get 100% of the funds, then these need to go for, educational projects, for health projects, or whatever that can be done, because the tokens are transforming into cash when they're spent at certain places that are linked to the business, to the network, if you see. But what was one of the great learnings from Plastic Bank is that we're actually going to have to set up physical offices in the countries in which we operate and work with local people who are employed by us.
Because the minute you've got, even if the community benefits for education, the minute you've got one person who doesn't benefit or who feels slighted from it, the tourist only needs to find that one person, or to know who that one person is. I mean, is there any way to get around that at all?
I think there's going to be a number of challenges that we're going to come across, and we're going to have to resolve them. Which is why we're setting up those working groups to try and bring in as many bright minds from multidisciplinary mindset to be able to help us tackle those challenges. Because Ian, myself, and Ralph don't have all the answers. And that's why for us, we really want to create a movement. So for all of you, who are watching this, if you're inspired, if you want to be part of it, just feel free, to connect with us on LinkedIn, and we'd love to have you, join us. Well,
that's the next question. You've got the call tomorrow about the working groups and how people can get involved. But if you could just share quickly how either individuals or companies can get involved. And Kieran is also asking about your estimate of your Go To Live costs and if you're looking for funding, which may not be how people can get involved.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, we will be looking for funding, but more for grants. I'm not looking for actual physical venture capitalists or investors. Venture capitalists want shareholder return. I want nature return. So those two are not usually quite aligned. But there are a very good projects like the Earthshot Prize that was launched by David Attenborough and Prince William that will be distributing 5 prizes of $1 million starting from next year, which we will apply for. But at the moment, it's literally we're going to be working with a number of individuals and companies who just want to put their bright minds and technology to use to help tackle this challenge that we're setting ourselves to resolve. We hope within the next 2 weeks to be able to make an announcement, but it will involve a technology company looking to potentially organize a hackathon to get developers from all around the world to help us tackle this issue about sensors, about how we can do it in an effective manner that is not intrusive as soon as possible.
So can you share the link to that working group discussion here, and then we can always get it emailed out tomorrow?
So it's a Zoom link. So let me get you. Yeah, let me get you that.
So I think that was my.
All right. So I'm putting it in the chat box.
Perfect.
So this is the Zoom link, and so it's 5:30 UK time and tomorrow. So if you're in Central Europe, it's at 6:30, and a whole lot of other times on. But do message me. Let me put in my email address here also. Mm-hmm. Or connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'll send you the calendar invite. We've got close to 20 people, I think, at the moment who've registered. And just to very fast paraphrase, what we're looking to have is a number of working groups. So I said we're going to need a science working group. We need science conservation. We need more people, like Ian to help us identify the living assets. We need an economist working group, which is people like Ralph, to be able to transform the scientific data in monetary value. We need a legal working group to help, provide legal envelopes around that living asset to protect it. We need a sensor working group, which is how we can monitor whether that animal is alive, a blockchain working group. But crucially, and very importantly, we need an ethics working group. I'm sure a lot of you would probably appreciate that a lot of good intentions create negative outcomes. To give you a very simple example, once countries start realizing that an animal has a huge value, and that animal has a migration pass that takes it outside of its jurisdictions, they may be incentivized to try and create barriers to prevent that animal going into a neighboring country. So these are the kind of challenges we're going to have to face. And so the ethics working group is not just about creating a system and codes and values that we as a company need to adhere by, but also how we project ourselves externally, but also whatever we do, how can it be avoided to be manipulated by others?
Like behavioral economics.
Exactly.
Yes. And also an outreach working group, maybe, to help.
And of course, an outreach, PR, marketing, branding, and working group. I mean, we've had so much awesome support by, for example, a lot of the branding work that we did on our slides was done by a small branding agency, which did it completely for free for us in terms of they just want to contribute to this project because they love what it is. They don't have the money, but they have the expertise. And that's a kind of passion and heart that we want to be able to collect around this initiative because we really do believe it can have an impact.
No, well, amazing. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, Ian.
I serve as an ambassador for the Convention on Migratory Species. So a UN convention that provides a legal framework for governments to cooperate in the conservation of species that, as Walid points out, move back and forth across these imaginary lines that we draw,
yes.
Not even on the ground. Sometimes it's just on a map of the ground. And so there are precedents of valuable animals being looked after on both sides of a border. And the one I know best is the mountain gorillas, where there is a 3-country agreement between Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC that a guerrilla group who is earning that country. I mean, in Rwanda, you pay $1,500 for a 1-hour visit to see the mountain gorillas. So if your group of gorillas goes over into the DRC or into Uganda, what happens to the money? Well, there is an agreement between those countries, and something similar will have to be put in place, because there's already an agreement to collaborate under the CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, for animals like elephants that move back and forth that are endangered. And I think the CMS will help construct a mechanism, a legal agreement that will take into account this. And that would have to be a commitment not to erect barriers. Do the exact opposite of President Trump. Don't build a wall. allow the free movement of these animals, because the forest benefits from that. And it works both ways. They bring nutrients and seeds from the other side into your country, and they take your nutrients and seeds into that neighboring country. And that understanding of shared responsibility for the ecosystem, so that everyone can benefit from the ecosystem services, has to be the foundation of this. But you're quite right, anything that involves millions of dollars is going to attract people who are more interested in millions of dollars than elephants or ecosystem services or carbon sequestration. So that's a challenge to us. That's why we need all the help we can get to construct not a foolproof system, a conniving, greedy, individual-proof system.
Yes.
No, amazing. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure some people will be interested to join that call tomorrow and see how they can help, and we'll get this spread out. But thank you so much, both of you, Ian and Walid, for sharing your information and your time on this. And thank you to everyone for joining. And hopefully we can see how we can support this going forward.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you to all the participants for your time and for all your questions. It definitely has spurred a lot of questions for myself, and I'm sure for Ian too, how we can improve our system.
Look forward to speaking more. Thank you, guys. And thanks again to Tracer for supporting the diamond industry and ethical mining and production of diamonds for the diamond industry. That's community.tracer.com. So big thank you to them as well. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.